he didn't disappear. "Tom?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure stepped into the light, and it was him. It was really him. I don't really know how to start this, but I need to get it off my chest. My name's Ethan, and a few months ago, I went through something that still haunts me to this day. I've always been a bit of an urban explorer. There's something about abandoned places that draws me in. The history, the decay, and the silence. But after what happened to me, I don't think you'll ever set foot in another one. It all started when I found out about this old factory on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, and I'd heard stories about it being a great spot for exploring. People said it was huge, with tons of floors and endless rooms to get lost in. So, naturally, I had to check it out. I planned to go on a Saturday. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. Just another adventure, right? I packed a flashlight, some snacks, my phone, and a few other essentials. I figured I'd be in and out in a couple of hours. When I got to the factory, I was in awe. The place was massive, way bigger than I expected. The entrance was wide open, so I walked right in. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of rust and decay was overpowering. I turned on my flashlight and started exploring. The first couple of hours were pretty standard. I wandered through old offices, storage rooms, and long, dark hallways. I took pictures of everything, excited to share my findings later. The place was like a labyrinth, but I was careful to mark my path with chalk arrows on the walls to avoid getting lost. At one point, I stumbled upon a staircase leading down to what I assumed was the basement. Curiosity got the better of me, so I descended into the darkness. The air got colder and damper the further I went. My flashlight flickered a few times, which creeped me out, but I pressed on. The basement was even more extensive than the floors above. It seemed to stretch on forever. I kept walking, taking turns here and there, but then something strange happened. No matter which direction I went, I kept ending up in the same place, a large room with a broken-down conveyor belt in the center. It was like the place was playing tricks on me. After a while, I started to panic. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. I tried using my GPS to find my way out, but it was useless. I was well and truly lost. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the shadows, at the far end of the room, was a figure. It was my brother, Tom. Or at least, it looked like him. Tom had died in a car accident 5 years ago. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but he didn't disappear. "Tom?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure stepped into the light, and it was him. It was really him. He looked exactly the same as I remembered, down to the clothes he was wearing the day he died. "Ethan, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. I was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Tom was dead. I had seen his body. We had buried him. He walked towards me, his expression serious. "You need to leave, Ethan. This place isn't safe." I can't find the way out," I stammered. He nodded almost sadly. "I know. That's why you have to be careful. Don't trust what you see here. It's not what it seems." Before I could ask him anything else, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I tried to follow him, but he was gone. I was alone again. I wandered through the basement for what felt like hours, desperately trying to find my way out. My flashlight was growing dim, and I was running out of battery on my phone. Every now and then, I thought I saw glimpses of Tom, but he was always just out of reach. Eventually, I found a door that led to a staircase going up. I practically ran up the steps, hoping it would lead me back to the ground floor. But when I reached the top, I was in another part of the basement. It didn't make any sense. I should have been above ground, but the labyrinth of corridors and rooms continued. I sat down, exhausted and terrified. I didn't know what to do. That's when I remembered the chalk arrows. If I could find them, I might be able to retrace my steps and get out of this nightmare. started searching the walls for my marks. After a while, I found one, then another. I was filled with a glimmer of hope. I followed the arrows, praying they would lead me out. But every time I thought I was making progress, I'd end up back in that room with the conveyor belt. It was like the factory was alive, changing its layout to keep me trapped. Desperation set in. I yelled for help, hoping someone would hear me, but my voice just echoed back at me. My flashlight finally died, leaving me in complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight app, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. My mind kept going back to Tom. Had I really seen him, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard voices. Real, human voices. I followed the sound. To my relief, I saw flashlights bobbing in the darkness. It was the police. They found me huddled in a corner, exhausted and scared out of my mind. They said they'd been searching for me for hours. Apparently, my parents had called them when I didn't come home, and they tracked my phone to the factory. I tried to explain what had happened, but it all sounded crazy even to me. They probably thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion and fear. But I know what I saw. They led me out of the factory, and as soon as I stepped outside, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sunlight was blinding after so long in the dark. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows. I haven't gone exploring since that day. I don't know if I ever will again. The memory of that place and seeing Tom still haunts me. I don't know what was real and what wasn't, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget that abandoned factory and the endless maze that tried to swallow me whole. As I was sitting there, I saw something strange in the sky. It wasn't a bird or a plane, but something else entirely. There's just something about the quiet solitude of abandoned places that appeals to me. The history, the decay. It's like stepping into another world. My girlfriend, Sarah, shares this passion. Or so I thought. It all started one weekend when I found this old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for decades, left to rot and decay. I told Sarah about it, and she seemed excited. We planned to go explore it together that Saturday. Friday night, I packed my backpack with all the essentials. Flashlights, batteries, first aid kit, water, and my camera. I couldn't wait to capture the eerie beauty of the place. Sarah was supposed to meet me at my house at 9 a.m. the next morning. I texted her to confirm, and she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. The next morning, I was up early, too excited to sleep. I double-checked my gear and waited for Sarah. But 9 a.m. came and went, and there was no sign of her. I called her, but she didn't pick up. I figured she must have overslept, so I decided to go ahead and check out the place myself. I left her a note in case she showed up while I was gone. The factory was everything I hoped it would be. Rusting machinery, broken windows, and walls covered in graffiti. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of decay and the sounds of nature reclaiming its territory. I wandered around, snapping pictures and imagining the bustling activity that once filled these halls. As I explored deeper into the building, I came across a series of old offices. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and desks covered in dust. I found some old documents, but nothing particularly interesting. It was then that I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, but I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, I was alone in a creepy old building. I continued my exploration, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. It was around noon when I decided to take a break. I found a spot by a broken window where I could sit and have some water. As I was sitting there, I saw something strange in the sky. It wasn't a bird or a plane, but something else entirely. It moved too fast and erratically to be anything natural. My curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to get a closer look, but it disappeared behind the clouds before I could figure out what it was. Feeling a bit unsettled, I decided to wrap up my exploration. I started making my way back to the entrance when I heard footsteps. I called out, thinking maybe Sarah had finally shown up, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace. I finally made it out of the building and practically ran back to my car. I tried calling Sarah again, but still no answer. I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange object in the sky and the footsteps I'd heard. When I got home, I was shocked to find Sarah sitting on my porch. She looked perfectly fine, no sign of having been to the factory. I asked her why she didn't meet me, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She told me she'd been home all day, that she hadn't planned to go exploring. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what this meant. If Sarah wasn't with me, then who or what did I see and hear at the factory? I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I was just seeing things or that it was someone else exploring the place. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Sarah noticed the change in me and tried to get me to talk about it, but I didn't know what to say. How could I explain something that didn't make sense even to me? I stopped going on explorations, the passion I once had for it completely gone. Sarah and I started drifting apart. She didn't understand why I had changed so much, and I couldn't explain it to her. Eventually, Sarah left. She couldn't handle the distance I had created between us. I was alone, haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of that day. The unexplained object in the sky, the footsteps, the realization that Sarah was never there. I still think about it sometimes, wondering if it'll ever find an explanation. But deep down, I know some things are better left unexplored. The factory still stands, a silent witness to whatever it was that happened that day. And I'm left with the lingering fear that it'll never truly understand what I experienced. So if you ever find yourself drawn to the eerie beauty of abandoned places, remember my story. Sometimes the most shocking and terrifying things are the ones that we can't explain. Mike and I froze, exchanging fearful glances. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the basement entrance. We scrambled to find a place to hide, ducking into one of the rooms and closing the door just enough to peek through. It began on a Tuesday evening. I was home alone, minding my own business, when I heard 3 distinct knocks. I froze, listening intently, but when I went to check, there was no one there. At first, I thought it was just some kids playing pranks, so I dismissed it. But the knocking continued every night at the same time. It was driving me insane. The knocks would come precisely at 11 p.m. The regularity of it unnerved me. I'd be sitting in the living room, watching TV or reading a book, and then there it was. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a soft, timid sound. It was deliberate and forceful, like someone wanted to get my attention urgently. Each time I rushed to the door, expecting to catch the prankster in the act, but there was never anyone there. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the knocks, I remembered the old abandoned building I had seen near my house. It was a large, decrepit structure that had been left to rot for years. I'd always been intrigued by it, but had never ventured inside. I decided that the next day I would go check it out. Maybe I could find some clues about who or what was knocking on my door. The next morning, I packed a small bag with a flashlight, some water, and my camera. I figured if nothing else, I could get some cool shots of the old place. I set out for the building, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. As I approached, the air seemed to grow colder, and an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The building was even more ominous up close. Its windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. I took a deep breath and pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the air was musty, and the floor was littered with debris. I wandered through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I explored deeper into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but it was hard to ignore. The rooms were filled with old furniture and papers, as if people had just up and left one day. I snapped a few photos and continued on. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The building seemed to have its own atmosphere, heavy and oppressive. I came across a room filled with rusted medical equipment and old, stained beds, suggesting it might have once been a small clinic. I wondered what kind of stories these walls could tell. Who had been here? What had happened? Eventually, I found a staircase leading to the roof. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to climb up. The view from the top was breathtaking. I could see my entire neighborhood from up there. I walked to the edge and looked down, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. That's when I heard it, the knocking sound. It was coming from below, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to head back down the stairs, but the door to the roof had slammed shut. I tried to open it, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I screamed for help, but there was no one around to hear me. I was stuck on the roof, and the knocking continued, louder and more insistent. I banged on the door, hoping someone would come to my rescue, but it was no use. As the hours passed, I started to lose hope. The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping. I huddled in a corner, trying to keep warm. I noticed something strange lights flickering in the windows below. It was as if someone or something was moving through the building. My heart raced as I watched the erratic patterns of light. Who else could be here? The knock stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps and distant voices. I strained to listen, trying to catch any words, but they were too muffled. Fear gripped me as I realized I wasn't alone. The building wasn't just abandoned. It was inhabited by something or someone I couldn't see. The night seemed endless. I could hear the creaking of the old structure, the occasional thud, what sounded like whispering coming from the floor below. I was on high alert, every sound amplifying my fear. The thought of jumping off the roof crossed my mind more than once, but the height made it impossible without serious injury. Finally, as dawn approached, the noises ceased. I gathered my courage and tried the door again, desperately hoping it had unlocked somehow. To my relief, it opened with ease. I didn't waste any time. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over the debris in my haste to escape. When I reached the ground floor, I paused to catch my breath. The building was eerily silent now, and the morning light filtering through the broken windows made it feel less threatening. I hurried out, vowing never to return. Back home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The knocks had stopped, but my sense of unease lingered. I started doing research, trying to find any history on the building. What I found was chilling. It had once been a mental institution, shut down decades ago due to inhumane practices and patient disappearances. The stories of abuse and neglect were horrifying. Despite my resolve to stay away, curiosity gnawed at me. I needed answers. I decided to return during the day, hoping the daylight would dispel the fear. I convinced a friend, Mike, to come with me, sharing only part of my experience to avoid scaring him off. We arrived at the building, and Mike, ever the skeptic, shrugged off my warnings. We ventured inside, the daylight casting long shadows across the decaying interior. As we explored, I noticed new markings on the walls, symbols and words I hadn't seen before. They looked recent, as if someone had been there since my last visit. In one of the rooms, we found old patient records scattered on the floor. Most were unreadable, damaged by time and the elements. However, one file caught my eye. It belonged to a patient named Daniel, admitted for severe paranoia and hallucinations. The notes mentioned he had constantly heard knocking and claimed to see figures in the shadows. My blood ran cold. It mirrored my own experience too closely. As we delved deeper, we discovered a hidden basement. It was dark and smelled of mold and decay. Reluctantly, we descended the rickety stairs. The basement was a maze of rooms, some filled with old equipment and others with remnants of patient belongings. In one corner, we found a makeshift bed, suggesting someone had been living there recently. Suddenly, we heard footsteps echoing above us. Mike and I froze, exchanging fearful glances. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the basement entrance. We scrambled to find a place to hide, ducking into one of the rooms and closing the door just enough to peek through. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a man, disheveled and gaunt, muttering to himself. He descended slowly, carrying a flashlight that barely cut through the darkness. We watched in terror as he moved methodically, checking each room. When he reached ours, he paused, his flashlight beam sweeping over the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come in. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on. We waited until the footsteps faded before daring to move. We crept out of our hiding place and made our way back upstairs, determined to leave the building for good. As we reached the ground floor, we heard the knocking sound again. It was louder and more insistent, coming from all around us. We bolted for the exit, not looking back until we were outside, gasping for air. Mike was pale, his skepticism shattered. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. I had no answer. We hurried back to my house, my mind racing with the implications of what we had seen. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The knocking didn't return, but the sense of unease grew. I started noticing things out of place in my house. Objects moved, doors left open. My paranoia intensified, and sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. One night, I woke to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was the man from the basement, his eyes wild and desperate. He didn't speak, but his presence was oppressive. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving me drenched in sweat and shaking with fear. The following day, I decided to move out of my house. The constant fear and paranoia were too much to bear. I packed my belongings and found a place on the other side of town, far from the abandoned building and its horrors. But even in my new home, the memories lingered. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corner of my eye, hear faint knocks in the dead of night. The experience had scarred me deeply, leaving me questioning my sanity. I've since sought therapy, trying to make sense of what happened. My therapist believes it was a combination of stress and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. The mind is a powerful thing, capable of creating nightmares that feel all too real. I'll never forget that night, the feeling of being trapped and hunted in that abandoned building. It's a part of me now, a constant reminder of the thin line between reality and illusion. And though the knocking has stopped, the terror remains, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to rest.